Welcome everyone to the new episode of BeyondPhrenology. Today we have with us Ben Bari. Ben is a PhD from University of Connecticut. He did his PhD thesis with Professor James Dixon there, from where he moved to Lehigh University as an assistant professor. And he just took up a new job at DCL's University uh, as an assistant professor of psychology. Ben has done some very interesting work on dissipative structures. He also has a chapter in my upcoming book volume, Alternate to the Computer Metaphors of the Brain. Um, and we'll be discussing with Ben what these dissipative structures are, what are the thermodynamic approaches to understand brain and behavior. And yeah, Ben, take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, Vidur. Um, I guess I should qualify. I was a visiting assistant professor at Lehigh University, for what it's worth. Um, yeah, so I guess dissipative structures, it would probably help to start with a definition of what these things are.
Yeah.
Um, they are a concept from physics. They were originally discovered and named actually in uh, chemistry. Uh, in general, they happen in systems that are what we call far from equilibrium. So if you have the right kind of system that has a continual input of energy, could be heat energy, could be electrical energy, like the systems that I primarily study, or in some of the early literature, could be chemical energy. When you have enough of this energy uh, present in the system or flowing through it, um, the processes within the system can spontaneously create structures. Could be spatial structures, like in a chemical system called the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction, where you get these really beautiful striping patterns, or sometimes these dot patterns that flash in and out. Uh, could be temporal structures in the sense of oscillations, which again also commonly happens in chemical dissipative structures, or some combination of the two, spatiotemporal structures. Right? And those structures are only maintained if that flow of energy continues,
Yeah.
if there is some kind of irreversible process, like a chemical reaction or the flow of heat or the flow of electricity. And so it's an inherently dissipative process, hence we get the name dissipative structures.
So you said temporal pattern, spatial pattern. Are we talking about the brain here again? We have a very nice spatial anisotropy in the brain, very specific to different regions, and we also have, very specific temporal patterns, including uh, oscillations at the meta level.
Yeah. Um, so it's certainly possible that each of those things arise uh, owing to sort of the principles of self-organization in dissipative structures. On the side of spatial differentiation, there's a long history in the sciences of physiology and biology of trying to understand, like, how do bodies sort of differentiate themselves, and how do we get the incredible, symmetry breaking of biological development, where you go from, effectively a
Yeah.
single cell that continually differentiates, right? Um, and one framework for that is the framework of morphogenesis, which means, I think, quite literally, like the production of shape, genesis of morphology. Um, and that you can trace roots to Alan Turing and his famous paper on the chemical basis of morphogenesis. That paper is really cool because it um, sets up the mathematics for understanding these self-organizing processes in the language of nonlinear dynamics. a branch of differential equations, basically. And while Turing wasn't exactly thinking in terms of dissipative structures, that term didn't actually exist yet. The chemistry underlying morphogenesis and the nonlinear dynamics that describes it is perfectly consistent with dissipative structures. And Turing does, even in that paper, he makes a remark about how in order for morphogenesis to happen, you need some kind of energetic process. Like, he recognizes the thermodynamic basis of it, even though he didn't build it into his theory. So, I mean, a radical suggestion is that, yeah, the differentiation of the brain into distinct parts is maybe a specific and complex form of morphogenesis. It's, these nonlinear interactions among complex chemical and genetic and probably electrical components that leads to differentiation.
But how specific is this talk about dissipative structures to brain cognition, given that we have symmetry breaking in almost every developmental process, right? Let's talk about kidneys, right? You can explain, the development of kidneys and the working of kidneys as well as a dissipative structure, right? It has a constant flow of energy as well as a constant uh, kind of a task which the kidney is doing, with those with that flow of energy. So is dissipative structure specific to the brain and cognition, or this concept can be applied to any form of life, any part of that form? So why to use it for the brain?
Sure, sure. Well, so I agree. It's not at all specific to the brain. And I think that's actually the strength of the idea, is that it applies so broadly
Yeah,
across biology. I think it's pretty beautiful.
yeah. We'll
Um,
talk about this particular idea. Yeah,
Wonderful, yeah. So why use it for the brain? I mean, uh, because to a certain extent, I'm not convinced that the brain is as privileged as people think it is. Like, it's certainly a unique um, development in biology, uh, but we often implicitly or explicitly treat it as this, like, uh, the borderline divine, kind of magical machine that
yeah.
can do everything, right? And I think it's, again, very unique, and there's a lot of characteristics that are specific to the brain that we ought to understand if we want to understand behavior. But uh, it is a specific, remarkable, complex kind of dissipative structure. And so there are, I think, at least two ways of studying the brain. You can study it from the perspective of the things that are unique to the brain, um, and try to understand how the specific characteristics of the human brain versus other animals, or the nervous system more generally compared to other physiology, and try to understand how did those principles of the brain um, support behavior and cognition and whatever else. Or you can treat the brain as a again, a specific kind of dissipative structure, or a specific kind of physiology, and you can look for what are some generic principles of, uh, what I think of as internal degrees of freedom for organisms, that, sure, they play out in the brain, but maybe they also play out in organisms that don't have brains, because there are, of course, a lot of organisms that do very intelligent things that don't have the sophisticated human brains, and a lot of them don't even have nervous systems at all, but still do remarkably intelligent things. And so we can try to say then, well, what is the brain doing that's similar to all of these other kinds of systems that support cognition? And so I'm sort of more interested in the latter way of studying the brain, but certainly the former is valuable and important.
I see. So 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 the So this approach basically does not privilege the brain, but it brings brain back into the same domain of biology in which other organisms and other parts of the same organism lie.
Yeah, kind of, right. So like a conservative way of thinking about how behavior works across all the animal kingdoms is that you've got some system that has to reorganize its internal degrees of freedom in a way to control its behavior, in a way to know about the world.
Right.
And those internal degrees of freedom take a lot of different forms. Like a slime mold uh, doesn't have a nervous system. It is composed of cells that are effectively identical and under the right circumstances actually behave as independent organisms. But in other contexts, they sort of aggregate and interact with one another and create a sort of a macro organism out of that. And so that's a system that, again, does very intelligent things. It forages for food. It actually shows some of the same uh, irrational
Yeah.
decision making as humans, which is a
And by the way, it
remarkable.
also shows spiking patterns, though much
Yes,
slower in the time scale, but it shows spikes. And one can actually decode those spikes, and they are consistent and they have information content as well.
beautiful, beautiful. Okay, yeah. So it's another system that has a whole bunch of self-organizing degrees of freedom uh, that it um, and it rallies those degrees of freedom in a contextually sensitive way so that it can pursue its goals, survive, behave, right?
What do
And
you
so,
mean by degrees of freedom here? This word often comes up in your explanation.
sure. Um, yeah, so here I mean it, I guess very generally, right? So not quite in the same sense that it's used in the action sciences, um, uh, but that in order to be, sensitive to the state of affairs out in the world, to like perceive something, it's not enough for there to be, information out there in the world, right? Like the structure of light. Um, you have to be sort of set up in the right way in order to perceive that. And so the being set up in the right way is vaguely what I mean um, when I'm talking about the internal degrees of freedom of an organism.
I
So when
see.
we traditionally think of a human, that means having your brain configured in the right way, where it's turning on in the right places is the traditional language, right?
Right.
Um, and then
At the right time.
exactly at the right time too. Yeah. Uh, and so similarly, as a slime mold has to do that in order to coordinate its behavior, right? It has to be set up in the right way to detect appropriate environmental circumstances and then to coordinate its activity relative to those
Yeah.
circumstances.
So we are talking about a whole bunch of diversity here. Uh, but our conceptual, or at least layman's, like for example, my conception of dissipative structure does not afford that diversity right now. Like my understanding of distributive structure, I see more as a simple class of structures compared to other class of structures. So what exactly is about the dissipative structures which bring in this much of diversity? Like, does it have that bandwidth to explain this diversity?
Yeah, um, it might not. I mean, uh, we always have to be skeptical as scientists.
Yeah.
One of the virtues of dissipative structure theory is that it's so one of the ways that it is inherently diverse is that dissipative structures occur in a lot of different kinds of media. So, like we said earlier on, you can get dissipative structures in chemical systems, but also in systems that are powered by heat and thermal diffusion, also in systems powered by electricity. Um, and so they occur whenever you have sufficient um, like energy exchanges, and probably some other prevailing factors have to be in place. And so you already have like a heterogeneity of different kinds of dissipative structures that you can get. And some of that is probably reflected in biology, because when you look at the processes that support physiology, I mean, you certainly have a mix of electrical and chemical processes that are interacting to produce things like brain activity and uh,
Yeah.
the metabolism. Yeah, so it's possible, and there's a lot of work by a gentleman whose name is not coming to me, uh, who looked at a whole bunch of physiological processes, from I think cardiac rhythms to neuronal rhythms to metabolism, and was able to describe them with the fundamental mathematics of dissipative structures, the same kind of nonlinear dynamics and bifurcation theory
Yeah.
that underlies, morphogenesis and that stuff.
So
Uh,
is this a different vantage point to look at things, which is consistent with other vantage points? So basically, it's just a vantage point, uh, or does it call for a, a redescription of what you understand?
yeah, it depends on whose vantage point we're comparing it to, right?
Okay.
It is a fairly radical departure from most traditional ways of thinking about physiology and cognition, because most of those traditional perspectives treat the body, mind, and brain as some kind of machine. And uh, in short, machines and dissipative structures just operate on different kinds of physics, and they have a lot of different fundamental differences. And there are uh, different entailments from assuming that your system is either a machine or a dissipative structure. So if we, paint with broad strokes and say that most of the way that we think about biology and behavior is in terms of mechanics and machines,
Yeah.
then absolutely dissipative structure theory is a completely different vantage point.
So I mean, to ensure that I'm clear about distributive structures, do you consider the microprocessor in my computer as a distributive structure or as a far from equilibrium system or not?
That's a brilliant question. Yeah, yeah. So let's look at the similarities, because there are some similarities, right? The microprocessor in your computer does need to be in a non-equilibrium state in order to work, right? If we stop pumping electricity through it, it's not
Yeah.
going to function anymore. Um, However, if you stop pumping electricity through it and then you pick that up again later, right? So you turn it off for a little bit and then turn it back on, it works perfectly fine, right?
Yeah.
Assuming there's been no other interventions in between.
Right.
Uh, so while its operation depends on the flow of energy, its actual existence
Does not.
doesn't depend on the flow of energy. Whereas if we look at a very classic dissipative structure, it's called Baynard convections. They occur when you take a fluid, typically a very thin bath of fluid, and then you heat it from below. And you can do this in the kitchen with a pan of oil, and at the right temperature, the hot liquid on the bottom will start to rise, give its heat off to the atmosphere, cool down and start to fall, and then that process generates all these vortices in the oil. So that's another very simple dissipative structure. You've got this organization now in the fluid that is driven by this heat flow.
Yeah.
If you turn off the gas, they disappear, right? They
Yes.
die.
Yeah.
So while a lot of machines do depend on an energy flux in order to operate, their actual existence is not tied to the flow of energy, uh, which is not true for dissipative structures, right? They depend intimately on the flow of energy. It's also not true for living organisms, right? If we stop
Yeah.
pumping energy into an organism, it dies, it falls
Right.
apart. Yeah. So the actual integrity of a dissipative structure is intimately tied to irreversible processes. There has to be this energy flow. And uh,
And I don't think we have any example of any such structure other than life forms. Is that true?
uh, I'm sorry,
So
could you ask the question again?
do we have any example of life form where if there's no constant flux of energy, the system
Oh,
basically, I mean, that's a definition, right? Definition of life, right?
yeah, yeah. So, well, there are, at the fringes of biology, pretty surprising exceptions to this. So there are, I think there might be a variant of cactuses. They're colloquially called resurrection plants, and they can go without water for exceptionally long times, and they become completely desiccated. I suspect all photosynthesis stops. But if they get water again later, they can sort of reanimate. So that's maybe a radical
I
exception
mean,
to
then
it.
likewise, we can have like wood frogs, for example, who hibernate and almost become like ice, and then reanimate in the hotter season.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Or even maybe just a plant's seeds are a better example.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
because seeds are dormant until they get water. So there are some exceptions to it. Um, I know at least in the case of seeds, there are still um, processes happening within the seed, so it's not actually completely in equilibrium. Seeds exchange at least oxygen with the exterior, and there's been some research on how they have actually a really slow metabolism. Uh, and so this is why seeds don't last forever. Uh, Older seeds become less viable. And so seeds, while seemingly dormant and not, they're certainly not photosynthesizing or seeking out food like an organism, they do still have these very slow dissipative processes maintaining them.
I see.
So with the exception of, again, these very fringe cases like those resurrection plants
Yeah,
or hibernation or what is it, the tardigrades, I think can um,
one
like
of my
free.
one of my favorite organisms. So cute.
Yeah, yes, they are. And I think they can, survive the vacuum of fate of space and then be reanimated, right?
Yeah.
But for most of biology, um, no, you need the continual flux uh, to stay alive.
Do tardigrades have neurons? They don't, right?
I don't think so. I think they're smaller than neurons, aren't they?
Yeah, and they look pretty. I mean, if you don't know the size and you're just looking at the video, right? Like what exactly are they doing under a microscope? They seem to do very intelligent stuff,
Yes.
like extremely
Yeah,
intelligent stuff. Yeah,
absolutely.
at least they give the aura that they're thinking or thinking and doing. The way humans do.
I
So
agree.
so so Ben, uh, where I'm trying to grill you here is, uh, what does it add other than defining a class of structures? So so for example, let's say I'm starting my neuroscience career, which is what was the case with you as well. uh, I've read your papers, and the physics, they're grounded in physics, and they're grounded in valid arguments about metabolism, about symmetry breaking, and concepts like that, entropy. But how does it empower a researcher, okay, to study things, to apply it in paradigms, for example, which we have already been using to to study behavior or to study brain under fMRI or using brain imaging. So does it also call for a complete methodological shift, or is it something which is applicable using the same methods? It's more an explanatory approach, or a different approach to interpret the same kind of measures which we have been measuring.
Right. It, I certainly think it requires a radical reimagining of what we're looking for when we do neuroscience or traditional psychology in any investigation of behavior. I imagine that we'll be able to use a lot of the techniques, the specific, empirical data gathering techniques that we've put together, and the bulk of the work is going to be in interpreting those data differently, rather than having to move to some kind of thermodynamics based science of the brain. So for example, um, uh, so psychologists, we have to be concerned with how an organism knows about the world. That's what a lot of our questions boil down to at
Yeah.
the base. What does it mean for somebody to know something? And our traditional cognitivist, mechanistic, machine-based perspective tends to presume that knowing means having some kind of internal state, having your
Yeah.
internal degrees of freedom set up in a way that corresponds with the environment.
Yeah, that represents the environment. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what dissipative structure theory can offer is a different way of understanding knowing that might or that will require us to think differently about what the brain is doing or what any organism is doing. Um, so we might again move away from thinking of this representationalist perspective, or the encodingist perspective, again with an appeal to
Yeah.
biology broader, because all organisms have to know about the world, everything from tardigrades to plants to slime molds. In order to survive and behave in the world, they have to know at least some basic level, right? And uh, to try to understand the kind of epistemic contact that those organisms have, we have to move away from our anthropocentric thinking about knowing, right? Because for us, we have this experience of knowing where it's like, oh, I can look inside myself and conjure up
Yeah.
an image or an idea. Um, More generally, I like to appeal to the sort of pragmatist perspective of knowing, which is, pragmatism in the sense of William James, and a long line of American psychologists in particular, um, which says that knowing is basically behaving effectively. Uh, Knowing is an organism being set up in a way
Yeah.
that is sensitive to the appropriate context, and that sensitivity um, biases or modulates or directs the activity of the organism. So perception and action being sort of intimately linked together. And that could involve, the phenomenology of an internal state and the feeling of having a thought inside of you. It will almost certainly require that there is some reorganization of the internal degrees of freedom that facilitates that process. But that reorganization of internal degrees of freedom doesn't necessarily encode the thing in the world. It's not standing in for whatever's out there. It's not standing in for the behavior that the organism is about to exhibit. It's just a process that sort of mediates effective knowing so that the organism can behave effectively.
Yeah. No, it makes much more intuitive sense than information theoretical approaches. Given that, I mean, ultimately, I think it has a potential to explain things like intent, for example,
Sure.
or more like a drive, right? Which information theoretic approach, I don't think it has the ability to explain. Uh, and also it brings into the current organismal state in the state of affairs
Hmm.
as engagement with the environment, because we're talking about metabolism directly here, and the
Hmm.
flow of energy. So we can definitely explain how an organism navigates the environmental landscape uh, uh, from the energetic standpoint.
Yeah, certainly. Um, right. So we gotta think about knowing differently. We gotta think about
Yeah,
intentionality differently, as you
yeah,
suggest. Um, now so far all I've done is I've sort of said, here's a different perspective of knowledge, one that's not machine based. Now where does dissipative structures fit into that? Um, so dissipative structures, at least the ones that I've studied, do seem to exhibit the this very basic kind of knowing, this more perception action, this pragmatic kind of knowing. Uh, they are intrinsically context sensitive, um, because they are, again, existentially tied to this
yes,
flux of energy. They are fundamentally context sensitive, right? Their
yeah,
whole existence depends
yes,
on the outside.
yes,
Um, and in some circumstances, that kind of makes them, in a way, poised to respond to changes in the environment an adaptive way. Um, so, for example, the electrical system that I primarily studied, uh, which is relatively simple. It's a shallow dish with some oil in it, and then a bunch of metal ball bearings. And you spray electricity over the dish. The beads become electrically charged, and they get attracted to this piece of metal at the perimeter of the dish, which is connected to the grounding electrode, effectively trying to complete the circuit. And so all those beads start moving around because they're electrically charged, and they tend to coalesce into these really beautiful kind of fractal-like
yeah.
structures that move around and interact with one another. Uh, so that's our dissipative structure here. It's the strings of beads and their behaviors that are powered by the flow of electricity.
Very similar one where you take this pieces of wood and you pass high voltage current through that, through two different points, and you see these fractal patterns emerging out of the wood,
Yes,
right?
yeah, the
Uh,
Lichtenberg figures, I think they might be called.
okay.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, the shapes of these dissipators of the bead structures are
Yeah.
similar. They're
And,
they're
and
definitely
and very similar to neurons as well.
yes, yeah,
Yes.
neurons. I think a lot of like vascular tissue looks very
Yes. All of
similar.
vascular tissue.
Yeah.
Right.
Uh, so where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so that system, um, intrinsically context sensitive, depends on the flow of electricity through it. Um, and what that ends up sort of setting up for the system is that any subtle change in the context, where the context here is basically just you can think of it as a two-dimensional array of electrical charges on the oil surface, which it can swim through and sort of soak up in order to stay alive. Any subtle change in that distribution of charges means something for the organism. it means, there is more, nutrition over here if there's more charges over here.
Yeah.
And remarkably, the system tends to move in a way that follows the charge gradient and tends to pursue regions of the dish that have more charges. So it will move in a way to find energetic resources to stay alive. And that's the kind of knowing that I think is fundamental to biology, where again the system is sensitive to the environment in a way that guides its behavior consistent with some kind of intention, like stay alive, which is the basic intention of basically all of biology.
And where, so I think it's a little distraction here, and it's
Hmm.
more meta-philosophical. Where exactly is that intent? In the sense, uh, why does that intent exist? Is it, uh, for example, we like especially more highly evolved organisms can be much more differentiated from their environment, right? Can be
Yep.
put into much more artificial flows and
Yep.
still do well, right?
Sure.
So if you look at the whole evolutionary uh, tree or bush or howsoever you want to call, whatever you want to call it, uh, we have more and more ability over evolutionary time scale to disentangle the form and function from this flow, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, uh, for a bacteria, you can put one toxin in the environment and you can kill the bacteria, but it won't be able to respond to it so well so fast compared to, for example, uh, humans, right? It's hot, so we go to a colder place. You we sleep. We make sure that the place is safe. No other organism can reach us when we are sleeping, and things of that sort. So where is that coming from? Like, do you think? Of course, it's a hard question.
Yeah.
But do you think the thermodynamic approach might have the ability to explain this kind of differentiation between the organism and environment?
It's possible. So Rod Swenson quite famously uh, theorized on how dissipative structure theory and thermodynamics might allow for evolution, and sort of actually drive evolution. Uh, so you started the question with a question about intentionality, and so maybe before we get to evolution, it might be helpful to visit that
Yeah,
idea of intentionality. Um, So again, our traditional perspective on intentionality is that it's some kind of internal state, right?
yeah,
Intention is um, the cause of our effect, which is behavior, right?
yeah,
And uh, when we look at the bead structure, which, as you correctly point out, I'm talking about it as if it has goals, as if it's trying to stay alive, right? Uh, it's certainly not thinking about those goals. It doesn't have any kind of internal state that stands in for that intention. Um, the intention is something that only exists in this self-organized state. So if the system falls apart, the intention also disappears. Um, Now, in physics, there are these things called variational principles, uh, which basically just say that you can predict the time evolution of a system according to how it's going to optimize some quantity, where optimize just means it's either going to minimize that quantity or it's going to maximize that quantity. Um, and those are actually a kind of a potential source of something like intentionality. So another way of thinking about intentionality is that it's and it's sometimes called spooky for this reason, because it looks like future circumstances are
Yeah.
constraining present circumstances, right? So I have a goal to get some food. um, I want to eat in the future,
Right.
and somehow that future state of affairs is going to direct my current behavior. And normally, that's those kind of explanations, teleological explanations, are ruled out in our contemporary science. We really want local, immediate causes, right? In
Both in
our
space and time, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so we're very much in our Newtonian framework, where we want
Yes.
local forces to explain everything. But in physics, these variational principles are actually kind of a pseudo teleology. Um, so the most famous place that they come up is in mechanics, actually, which is again the science of just rigid bodies moving through space traditionally. Um, you can, of course, describe the trajectory of a projectile, for example, in terms of all the forces on that body at every instance in time. That's the brilliance of Newtonian mechanics, right? And it works very, very well. In the 20th century, actually, no, this is not true. People were writing about this idea earlier. So I don't exactly have the history right, but there's this other sort of parallel set of physical principles that you can use to again describe the exact same thing, the trajectory of some ballistic object, that doesn't depend on the local forces. What you can do is say, for the given circumstances, whatever the body is that we're looking at, you can apply this principle called the minimum action principle. And what it ultimately allows you to do is say that the trajectory it's going to follow is the one that has the minimum action over the whole course of the event. And action is just a physical quantity. It's I think it's usually units time, or units of energy times some time unit. So I think it's usually joules times seconds. Uh, so perfectly physical quantity that you can just measure objectively. But again, what you get from this principle is you say, okay, I can predict the trajectory of this ball um, uh, based on which of all possible trajectories is going to have the minimum action one. And
Yeah.
so it kind of has this pseudo teleology where it's as if the system is sensitive to possible future states, and then it selects the one that over the course of that time period, over the integration, has the minimum uh, of this physical quantity of action.
And it does so without computing.
Well, I mean, certainly if we're talking about a ball moving through space, yeah, a ball can't compute anything, right?
Yeah.
What we're talking about here is us predicting its path, and we of course need to compute it, whether we're computing it by looking at the forces on it at every instance in the traditional Newtonian perspective, or by integrating the action and trying to figure out which trajectory has the minimum action. For the ball, it just does it. Right?
Yeah.
So anyways, these variational principles are a potential source of intentionality, or something like teleology, how a system can be constrained by possible future states. And so in dissipative structures, there's been a lot of work trying to identify a possible variational principle and say that, okay, when you got these systems that are self-organizing, maybe they're evolving to states that are constrained by some variational principle.
I see. Yeah.
The most common one is this idea of a maximum rate of entropy production principle. Um, for our purposes, the rate of entropy production is basically it's um, it corresponds with how much energy is just flowing through the system. And so maximum entropy production would say that the system evolves towards some state that has the most energy flowing through it. And that's what we observe in that electrical system that I've studied, where reliably, for a whole bunch of different initial conditions, it will select morphologies that maximize the rate of entropy production or maximize the electrical current flowing through it. It will behave in ways that consistently maximize the current flowing through it as well. And so it looks like it's sort of embodying this variational principle.
Yeah.
And so this is possibly the grounding of intentionality for dissipative structures.
Right.
That they are optimizing some physical quantity.
And when the structures grow more complex, you might have kind of an optimization where you have, for example, you optimize for one, but at the same time you also have to optimize for the other within some boundary conditions, and a third and a fourth, and they kind of uh, impose constraints on each other. And finally, you might have like a very high dimensional space of optimization rather than just one variable or one factor.
Yeah, almost certainly. We've done a little bit of work looking at multiple tree structures, and one of the interesting findings was that they seem to coordinate in a way that maximizes the current for the whole system,
Yeah.
not just for individual trees. So you're absolutely right. They do sort of mutually constrain each other. So, for example, if you have two trees and they don't have particularly exciting shapes, they're just lines of beads, so they're perfectly straight. And you put them next to each other in the field, they like to oscillate individually. And what you'll really reliably observe is that they synchronize, which is not surprising for most
Yeah.
people that have looked at oscillation in biology, because almost everything synchronizes. And that synchronization is the dynamic which maximizes the current for the whole system.
I see.
So what that looks like is that they are sort of adapting their behaviors through that mutual constraint in a way that satisfies like a system level intention or something, which might mean something for biology. I don't know.
No, of course, especially for I mean, life forms synchronize as well, right? I mean, in ways we might not apparently understand, but even when you look at biodiversity or look at an Amazonian rainforest, right? It's kind of a synchrony at different time scales. Not in terms of motion, because we think a lot in terms of motion, that we visualize a lot in terms of motion, but not in terms of the movement of the plants and animals. But synchronization can happen at the level of metabolism. It can happen at the level of at molecular level. It can have at the level of, for example, uh, uh, the usage pattern of resources like oxygen and environmental nitrogen, for example.
Sure. Yeah. Or closer to home, right? All of the nested physiological processes that are within circadian rhythms, right?
Yes, they're all synchronized.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So then this is I read your piece for the book, as well as I read your articles. it seems a very potential, like where exactly is this framework needing the work to be done? Like what would be the building steps?
Yeah, it's a hard question. Um, there are at least two key branches. Um, One is along the same lines that I've been doing in the past, which is actually just working with the non-living systems. And really our approach has been kind of asking embarrassingly simple questions. It's mostly been about cataloging lifelike characteristics of these non-living dissipative structures, and trying to motivate that the behaviors and properties that we observe in biology are derived from organisms being dissipative structures. And so um, uh, developing more complex and interesting dissipative structures is going to be very, very fruitful.
Hmm.
Um, Even the simplest organism has so much more going on in it than any dissipative structure that has been studied up to date, any non-living one that is. Um, and part of that complexity is having a heterogeneity of processes, especially chemical processes.
Yeah.
And so one of the um, goals of this uh, program is to start developing more sophisticated, especially chemical dissipative structures that just have more stuff going on for them.
And probably
Uh,
interdependent structures as well.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. Because when you look at biology, every single process is sort of mutually maintaining, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I always had this. I always used to tell my friends that, and out of no data, just out of my intuition,
yeah,
that I had this hunch that probably if we want to synthesize all the enzymes, all the chemicals, everything which happens inside the body, we probably need a lab of the size of New York,
yeah,
right? And a lot of those reactions we might not be able to achieve because we don't know what exactly is the catalysis for that, right?
right.
So, and in the body, like one compound is catalyzing and basically making it billion times more probable for another reaction to happen.
Yeah, it's these incredibly dense webs of catalysis and yeah, mutual maintenance.
Yeah, mutual
Uh,
maintenance. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so anyways,
Yes.
the very simple, line to that process is to somehow have dissipative structures that have yeah, or systems that have like nested dissipative structures maybe, um, or having just multiple chemical dissipative structures that are somehow, maintaining each
Right.
other. Uh, that would help us to push a little bit closer to biology, and probably, hopefully, we'd start, seeing things that we couldn't predict from that, things that are even more lifelike or more interesting. Um, the other line of research, in addition to just trying to develop more non-living ones, is to try to actually study organisms and apply some of the principles of self-organization to biology. Uh, that's actually, well underway. There's a lot of researchers that apply different parts of dissipative structure theory and the physics of self-organization to biology and behavior. Um, in psychology, there's, the application of nonlinear dynamics and bifurcation theory, and those ideas of symmetry breaking, to, especially in the literature of like affordance detection and uh, um, yeah, how you change your behaviors, and treating those changes in behaviors as phase transitions, which in the physics language is the emergence of some kind of structure or the change from one structure to another. So there's a long history of that kind of work. Um, and some of that is happening also in the brain sciences. So uh, Kelso in Florida, who has a long history of applying um, the principles of self-organization and phase transitions to behavior. He's now doing a lot of research on the brain and looking at how maybe the brain is making phase transitions between metastable states and how that facilitates everything from perception to changes in action. Um, there's also the sort of statistical side of dissipative structure theory and the physics of self-organization, especially the you know the whole broad category of like scale-free analyses and turbulence and cascades, which I know you know very, very well.
Yeah.
Uh, and all of that is being applied to uh, biology, to behavior, and to the brain. Um, so those are for me the two main branches of what it means to pursue this dissipative structure theory, to develop these more lifelike organisms or lifelike dissipative structures and
Yeah.
study them, and then apply some of the principles of self-organization to biology.
What is interesting is that so when I was growing up, I was in school. I used to look down upon biology, okay, and I grew up in India, so everything is about cracking IITJ, engineering exam, entrance
I see.
examination, and become, go to these best engineering institutes.
Yep.
So of course, I never took biology. I was attracted to biology only when I went to college and you know had the luxury to indulge myself into it, right? And you see, very early on, people used to differentially go to biology without any background in physics and
Mm.
mathematics at some point, right? And then biology called upon a lot of physics and chemistry and mathematics. Now we have whole fields in biology which are basically mathematicians working in them,
Yep.
physicists working in them, and it's very hard for a person just trained in biology to do anything,
Mm.
in those fields.
Yep.
What reminds me about your work is that it's more physics than psychology. So now, is it happening in the psychology domain as well? And the two approaches you also mentioned uh, are also heavily mathematically and physically dominated spaces.
Yep.
So are we seeing the end of, like, how did you come up? I know that you graduated from a department of psychology, so you definitely intended to be a PhD in psychology. So can you tell a little bit about your career trajectory and what got you interested in there? And did you have a background there, or did you learn during your grad school? And how easy or difficult for it was it for you?
Yeah. Uh, I was, and I mean, I still consider myself to be pretty math phobic and pretty poor at math. Um, so I was drawn to the ecological program at UConn um, just because I thought um, I was actually attracted to the whole dissipative structure story because Jay Dixon was working on that while I was an undergraduate at UConn, and so I happened to read some piece about it, and I thought it was just fascinating. And I at the time I may have already been a cognitive science major, um, so I wasn't really taking many courses in math. Um, when I realized that I wanted to do something that was more physics based, and then learned that the ecological program likes to apply all this nonlinear dynamics and stuff. I did decide to pursue a math minor, so I started taking a bunch of classes and not doing terribly well in them.
Mm.
But I got the minor, and so I did have to put in a bit of extra work to pursue that line. Um, I don't know if that's going to be necessary for every psychologist. So I don't think that, to be an ecological psychologist or a, you know, embodied or an activist psychologist, whatever label you want to put on it, um, or to apply dissipative structure theory to behavior, I
Yeah.
don't think that you have to be a physicist or a mathematician. Um, uh, so one of the places that you see uh, nonlinear dynamics or the dynamic systems perspective applied really rigorously, but also fairly intuitively to psychology is in developmental psychology, especially the work of Thalen and Smith, and that whole line of research. Uh, and of course, they did a lot of quantitative stuff as well and very
Yeah.
sophisticated stuff. But at the same time, the way that they talk about phase transitions and metastability and
Yeah.
uh, those principles of self-organization are super super intuitive,
Yes.
uh, and I don't think that they require doing the math. Um, you can still apply those concepts and study psychology in a fairly traditional way, which was a lot of how they collected data, and then they would go to the modeling and uh, use the model to just support the concepts of phase transitions and whatever else they're using.
Yeah.
So that's all to say. Again, I don't think you need to be a physicist or a mathematician in order to do this kind of contemporary psychology. What it really requires, though, is just radically rethinking the assumptions of psychology. So actually,
Yeah.
you might be better off not being a psychologist just because you haven't yet been indoctrinated with the machine cognitivist perspective.
I,
That's
I can't agree more with that.
yeah, that's really the only benefit of being a mathematician or a physicist is
Yeah.
that you don't know anything about psychology, and that will
Right.
help you do psychology better.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. Yes. I mean, it's the same thing in molecular biology because when I was undergrad, took a cell biology course, and to me the fascination. I mean, I got it was a machine metaphor which made me actually choose biology. So I
Mm,
started reading Bruce Albert's molecular biology of the cell,
okay.
and almost every picture is talks about molecular motors or molecular machines, or so basically the whole book had visualizations
Yep.
which had nothing but machine connotations and machine kind of explanations to them. And for me, who always wanted to be an engineer, that was the motivation to come to biology because I could see machines in biology.
I
But
see.
only when I arrived into biology and psychology, I figured out like no, the machines were not there.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's amazing. The machine perspective sort of takes out everything that's interesting about biology and remarkable.
it does. Yeah,
And there is a lot of or a fair bit of brilliant work in, I guess it's technically theoretical biology, but it's really a radical reinterpretation of observations in biology, especially from this gentleman Daniel Nicholson.
yeah. He has a book
Um,
called Everything Flows,
yes.
uh, and I'm expecting him to be on the podcast in a few months as well.
Oh, good,
Yeah,
good. Okay, I'll look forward to that
it's
episode.
a beautiful book.
Yeah, but anyways, he's
Yeah,
really breaking down the machine perspective in biology and
right.
sort of bringing back into focus all of the things that actually make biology really remarkable and very distinct from the physics
Yes.
of mechanics.
And
We
the metaphors which he is trying to bring in, if you read the book Everything Flows, which is actually an edited volume,
yeah,
it's all basically fluid systems, thermodynamics, back to biology again.
right, right, yeah, yep. Because we tried to
Yeah,
do mechanics on biology,
yeah,
uh, and because that was a physics that we had figured out, and we got really good at.
right.
Uh, and so we thought, well, mechanics seems to govern everything from terrestrial things to the stars in the sky.
Yeah.
And so it must be fundamental. It must be the thing that underwrites biology. But it turns out biology is a little bit harder to
Uh,
describe.
so why do you think, when that's the case? I mean, you talked about indoctrination, right? So
Yes.
why? I mean, it's great that you have taken this teaching position. Like you can change the whole generation of psychology students,
Yeah.
learning some alternatives, or at least to avoid that indoctrination. Why do you think that's the case? I mean, it's still dominant, right? I mean, you would have faced probably some consequences in terms of the funding, in terms of the opportunities, or in terms of the scope in which you can take your work. Why do you think that's the case? Like, why does machine metaphor sell? Or
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's lots of reasons. Not the least of which is that it's a great scientific theory. It's you know, there's a long history of really brilliant insights that facilitate the machine perspective, and actual empirical observations that support it. And so it is, in my perspective, it's a very, very useful fiction, which is probably true of basically any scientific framework, right? We're always, I'm not sure in science we're doing much more than building really complex metaphors,
yeah,
and then using them to try to predict what happens in the world. And the best measure of a scientific framework is the practical outputs of that
yeah,
framework. And the mechanical perspective works really damn well, especially for the natural world, but also for developing a lot of technologies for biology and even for understanding psychology, right? Um, so one of the places that this like a good example of this is in functional localization in the brain. That's a inherently machine-based perspective. It says that, like a machine that has specific parts that serve specific functions, the brain has physiologically distinct regions that serve specific functions. And so it's fundamentally mechanical, but it also just works really well in a lot of circumstances for describing the activity of the brain and how it corresponds with behavior, right? There are these
yeah,
remarkably robust, um, uh, uh, consistent relationships between parts of the brain and their function, right? For the vast majority of people, seeing something involves a whole bunch of activity in your occipital lobe, right? And same for a whole host of processes, right? And so while there are loads and loads of exceptions to those rules, and things like Michael Anderson's neural reuse in his book, After Phrenology, which maybe you're familiar with,
of course.
um, yeah, um, is pointing to all the ways that localization of function doesn't hold up. I mean, there's still a whole bunch of ways where it does hold up.
Yeah.
And so, part of why it sticks on is it's just practically useful, right? And established scientists that have to secure funding, publish, teach, and also just survive and live their life. They
Yeah.
don't have time to radically rethink the assumptions under their work.
Also, it's
Uh,
hard to believe, like when you're like 50 years old, that you generated a whole bunch of fiction. It's a really weird feeling.
yeah, yeah. So anyways, it's useful fiction, and so I
Yeah.
think dissipative structure theory will similarly be useful fiction.
Yes.
Um, it's just that it's going to be useful in different ways from um, uh,
Right.
the traditional mechanical perspective.
So
Now,
we can say that some fiction are less fictional than others.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I like to think so, and yeah, and it's also the case again that it's not like the machine metaphor is a ad hoc hypothesis. It's not just like people saw computers and were like,
Yeah.
maybe the brain, right? there's this really rich and brilliant intellectual tradition of uh, the cognitive sciences and the philosophy of mind that really, really beautifully motivates the computational perspective. And most of the ideas um, supporting the computational perspective were established before computers existed, right?
Yeah.
It so we sort of already had the computational perspective, and then Turing comes along and says, look, you can, those rules of logic that you guys are interested in and that you think underwrite all of psychology, look, I can put those into a machine. And then from there, things really take off. So that's all just to say that, like, there's a lot of good intellectual reason to think that the mind might be a machine. Um, so yeah.
No, no, that makes complete sense. It's extremely nuanced, both for good and bad. And I always wonder, like, what kind of historical accidents led to this. For example, the invention of fMRI. Let's say that we had psychology and we had neuroscience, but we never had fMRI. Then how would our understanding of the brain and how we think about the brain would have been? Let's say we had a tool which can measure dissipation compared to electrical activity, right, in the
Right.
brain. So then we would think about the brain very different. So I think there are tools actually, our ability, or in general, our tendencies are extremely constrained by what kind of tools we have, what kind of approaches we have. Uh,
Yes,
and those are historical accidents more than one step more towards the truth. They're more historical accidents.
definitely. I
So
agree. Yeah. Which is why we need a heterogeneity of ideas and
yeah, exactly. So that more accidents can happen.
yep. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. But that's the tricky thing about being in basic science like I am, is um if you don't have a pathway to practical results, right? It's less appealing, right?
It's less
The
appealing. It's extremely difficult to get funding
Yep,
because there's a call for this mechanistic in general. Like everyone wants okay, where's the mechanism here? Okay, and it's very hard in general for a lot of us uh, to understand anything which does not have condition A versus condition B, manipulation A versus B, and having like a t-test or an ANOVA kind of results, right? The
yep,
dynamics itself, even though we say that we are looking at dynamics and we are looking at dissipation or process, most of the time we are not looking at the process because we have this one measure which summarizes things, and when
yep,
we do analysis of variance across subjects
right,
on that measure, right? So where's the dynamics? The dynamics is all gone.
right,
Yeah, so yeah.
yep,
So Ben, uh, it was a great conversation. I mean, got to know a lot about dissipative structures. Do you suggest any, of course, your work with J. Dixon? What else do you recommend for us to
yeah,
read to
yeah.
know
I would
more
actually,
about these structures? Yeah.
sure. Don't read my stuff. There's a lot of smarter people.
Okay.
Um, no, so
Yeah.
so uh, I owe a lot, of course, to Jay Dixon, and his lab was writing stuff before I joined on. Um, Dilip Kondapudi, much to my shame that I haven't mentioned him yet, he's a immensely brilliant physicist. He worked with Ilya Prigogine, who was a Nobel laureate and who discovered and coined the term dissipative structures. So Dilip has lots of writings on dissipative structures, especially chemical dissipative structures and chirality. But also more recently, he's been very, very strongly advocating for this abandoning the machine way of thinking. And so a lot of, he's a co-author on, I think, almost everything I've ever written. And he's a continual source of inspiration for this idea of abandoning the machine metaphor. So definitely read anything with Dilip's name on it. Um, I would also point people towards Daniel Nicholson, who we were talking about, for that process perspective on biology. Mark Bickard
Yeah.
has actually done a lot of work to make dissipative structures really relevant for psychology. And um, uh, yeah, I think his work is often overlooked, but especially if you're trying to make connections between dissipative structures and the mind, he's got some really brilliant insights.
I did listen to one of his lectures he gave at some institution.
Yeah,
Pretty remarkable. Yeah,
agreed. Yes, yeah.
great. Ben, it was pleasure. I will put these links for the viewers in the description of the show.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks
And
again so much for having me. This has been really fun.
yeah, and hopefully we'll have you again going further into details, uh, which you did not.
Sure.
But yeah, thanks for coming to the show.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Madhur.
Yeah, bye bye.